Well, good afternoon again, and I thought we had a terrific session. The first session, Wolf Blitzer did a marvelous job. Remarkable for me to see all of these distinguished public servants with us this afternoon. They were stimulating, they were informative in the first hour, even entertaining, I thought. I'm not sure they're going to rival Jay Leno or David Letterman, but they're getting pretty close. And so we had a terrific session. I have the privilege of kicking this off for the second hour. And I want to put a question to you that I think is a little argumentative. I think I know how you will respond. I spent a good part of my time in the Congress trying to get the administration, any administration, to articulate and define American foreign policy in detail. And one of my great frustrations was that I could never get the National Security Advisor before a congressional committee. Now, you're all very able people, and when you confront newsmen, you have the upper hand. And they don't usually ask the follow-up questions. And you can pretty well control it. When you come to the Congress, it's a little different. There is such a thing as accountability in our government, and the National Security Advisor is either the top advisor to the President or among the top 2 or 3 advisors to the President on foreign policy. Why should not a National Security Advisor who holds this position not be directly accountable to the American people through the Congress? Now, one answer you suggested a moment ago was that it would impede your advice to the President. That was not true in the case of Bob Rubin, who was the Secretary of the Treasury and was repeatedly called before the Congress. So let's take another crack at this question. Why should you not be accountable to the American people through the Congress?
Well, would you make the Chief of Staff accountable in the same way, or virtually every White House staff member?
Look, Frank, I think the National Security Advisor occupies a very special place. He is, if not the principal advisor, he's among the 2 or 3 principal advisors to the President on foreign policy. You're perfectly willing to go before all of the TV networks anytime they give you a ring, if you want to go. Why should you discriminate against the Congress?
Lee, I think any national...
I told you it was going to be argumentative.
I think any national
But Lee, you're
security
saying
advisor,
it's a civil rights issue.
any national security advisor who got a call from the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to come on up and talk in their office would be out of their mind not to go up. In fact, during my period, I regularly met with the House and Senate majority and minority leaders and many others, as Bud was saying, is important informally. But there's not only a chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. There's a chairman of Foreign Operations. There's a chairman of the House Defense Committee, and it's hard, of course, once you've submitted to the proposition that you can be summoned up to the Hill. It's hard to say, well, you know, the Foreign Relations Committee is more important than the Defense Committee, or the appropriators are more important than the authorizers. And I think you really have changed the nature of the job. I think the National Security Advisor is accountable. I can't imagine not responding to a request to come up. My frustration was often that I couldn't get enough people in the House of Representatives to come down to the White House to talk about foreign policy. But I think best left informally.
Let me make 2 comments. One is that the point several of you have made, and you just made, Sandy, is right, that secretaries spend an awful lot of time on Capitol Hill. And to me, that says Capitol Hill has to reorganize the way they make inquiries of secretaries. But it is not the same thing for a secretary, for a national security advisor to come into the private office and meet behind closed doors with members of Congress. That's not the same thing as going into a public body and answering questions, in my judgment. They're two different things. And every one of you responded to congressional questions and went up to the Hill. And Bud McFarland was particularly sensitive to the Congress because, as I recall, your father was a congressman. But I draw a distinction there. I know how you feel about it. I guess it's a kind of a different perspective, one from the executive branch, one from the congressional branch.
Can I come at it from
Yeah.
a slightly different perspective? That the person who's accountable is the president.
That's my point, yeah.
And, you know, these are staff people to the president. We had a case where the president was almost brought down because of the actions of National Security Council staff, Ronald Reagan. So there is an accountability system, and the president should be free to pick whomever he wants to give him advice. And in fact, if you, as I said earlier, if you make the National Security Advisor subject to confirmation, the president's going to pick somebody else to operate his foreign policy with.
We'd call them up too. Ed?
One question, there's been much debate and different organizational approaches toward how the president deals with economic issues, social issues, human rights, environment, demographic issues. Walt Rostow and I was speaking just before about the role of demography and how it can affect national security. What do you think is the best paradigm in terms of the president organizing his staff? Should there be a National Economic Council sitting next to a National Security Council that deals with the more traditional war and peace issues, or they should be melded into one larger group?
I think that's one of the hardest issues to deal with. I found it very difficult. I started out thinking, gee, I want to be a big player in the economic area. No way. I just couldn't do it. I had economic people on my staff. Sandy will have to address how the National Economic Council worked. I gather the current administration's abolished it and is going to try a different model. But I don't think there's any national security advisor who's ever really been successful in getting his or her arms around economic issues.
Walt, do you want to?
I haven't thought very much about where you locate this, but let me tell you the problem. Let me share the problem with you. I happen to be working very intensively on the demographic issue around the world. We're between a radical fall, a dramatic fall, a mortal fall in fertility, and a fall which will begin very soon, or has begun already, in Russia and European Russian states, former Soviet states, and in Japan. You're about to see a fall in population. The end of the period of fertility has come. You have extremely low and dangerously low fertility rates in Spain and Italy and Germany and the states of Eastern Europe. Only Poland is barely holding its above 2.1. The fertility in Mexico is falling very fast, and it's cut in half in the last 3 years. And in fact, the same is true of India, believe it or not. The people talk about the United States being very lucky because we have the flow of Hispanics to America. The great force at work is not the rise of anti-immigration feeling, which is beginning to come and will come in a depression that's come in Europe already. It is the fact that the fall in fertility is raising the average population level in Mexico. And by the middle century, Mexico will be worried about how to look after its old folks. And will have at least the level of affluence of New Zealand at the moment. In other words, the Mexicans will be like the Brazilians. The Brazilian president is alleged to have said, he's a very thoughtful sociologist, that right now I'm worried about classrooms, but very soon I'll be worried about old folks' homes. This is a global issue, except for Africa, which is still suffering from the classical Malthusian problems. I think the issue has a tremendous influence on strategy throughout the world, military strategy. People don't know it in the newspapers. I don't know why it's not known, but it's known to every demographer that the problem in Japan right now is population and the population fall, which will begin in 2007. I would think that what you really need is the formulation of a population summation for the U.S. government, which will be essentially global, and out of which you can formulate a national policy. But I've come slowly over the last 5 years to believe that we are talking now about one of the great issues of the 21st century.
And you're basically considering it's a national security issue.
And it has great implications for international security and for the economy, world economy.
May
Can
I
I
ask
come
Sandy,
in with this?
and then Zibik, go.
This is an example of several issues that need to be considered, and it raises the issue, how do we relate some sort of coherent strategic planning to policymaking? And the issue that Walt raised has strategic implications, and they're far-reaching. There are a great many others. They involve health, food, ecology, social trends, ethnic trends, breakup of some big states. There is really no centralized planning mechanism in the U.S. government. The State Department has a policy planning council. The Defense Department has a planning office. Sometimes there are planners on the NSC. I think it was a big mistake that Kennedy, in reducing the staff even more than was the case already, when he came to office, abolished the planning board that Eisenhower had on the NSC. The only place in the government where there can be long-range planning of a coherent strategic type is, in some fashion, the White House, presumably related to the NSC. It doesn't even have to be the NSC itself, but it could be something related to it. For example, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board could be used for long-range anticipation and for drawing strategic conclusions from it, and then from reporting to the NSC advisor, and letting him know that certain long-range issues have more immediate policy implications. The point here, of course, is one of balance. You can't turn this exercise into some sort of an academic think house. It has to be related to policy. But having such a body and then some mechanism of transmission to the NSC, I think would fill a need that truly exists today. We just don't have coherent strategic planning in the national security area, broadly understood in the U.S. government.
Sandy, do you want to comment on how
First
you?
of all, I agree with what Zbig has said, and I think his proposal is very appropriate.
It's actually not my idea. I don't want to claim credit for it, but it's something I've had.
His now cited proposal.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to the organizational issue. The role of the NSC with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of the global economy obviously needs to change. And there needs to be, I believe, a kind of protean quality to the NSC, which enables it to configure itself differently depending on the issue. I said before there are issues of terrorism in which you need to have the Justice Department and the FBI on the table. There are issues of, among the most important issues we dealt with was the Asian financial crisis and the Mexican financial crisis, where Treasury obviously plays an indispensable role. So I think, first of all, while there are some core agencies in the NSC, there has to be kind of a situational definition of participation. The NSC and EC, I think, was a useful device, and understand that the NEC principally deals with coordinating domestic economic policy, which for which there had been no similar mechanism. But where economic policy and foreign policy intersect on trade, on international economics, I think it's a useful device, and we shared a staff between the NEC and the NSC. And it was uneven, but generally I think was positive.
Take one last comment, then we'll go to questions from our audience, Andy.
I think you've identified a real challenge here. And as Frank says, trying to put the economic together with the classical strategic and security is a stretch. And it becomes very hard to operate. But some new thinking about a national policy council that would look to the kinds of issues that Walt has talked about here. I go back, again, to the early Eisenhower days, and this goes to Lee Hamilton's point about what is the policy. After Stalin died, there were all kinds of suggestions, let's do this, let's do that. Eisenhower, after thinking this over, set up a group called the Solarium Group. And that group, for that group, defined three main lines of policy that would have an endurance for quite a number of years. One was, at the time, containment. One was drawing a line with the threat of massive retaliation. And one was rollback, which had figured in Eisenhower's first election. And he charged a small group of 8 or 9 individuals with making the best possible case for each of those 3 small groups. They worked through a hot summer here in Washington, I might say, and finally gave the results, taking an hour apiece on each of these. And at the end of it, Eisenhower himself jumped up and said he wanted to summarize and comment on what they had heard. He talked for 45 minutes without a note. George Kennan he called him back to head the containment. George Kennan said, in doing so, he showed his intellectual ascendancy over every man in the room. And I said, George, that includes you. And he said, that's all right, because Eisenhower understood the military and the strategic aspects of all of it. Out of that came a policy paper which was crafted by the national security apparatus, the planning board in particular, and that became a center line for policy. Now, I think some lessons can be drawn from that. A policy council could have the assistance of a planning board with representation at the level of assistant secretary and comparable people who would identify issues of the kind that have been suggested here, identify what I have come to call the issue of human security around the world. Not just national security, but human security. Where does that stand in the responsibilities of the American government? I use that as an example of what could be done. I think Eisenhower made clear to the Congress what line of policy he was proposing to follow. And I think that could be done on these broader issues that have been identified. I would suggest also a look at what were called in Walt Rostow's time, what was called the Senior Interdepartmental Group, with that representation at deputy secretary level that could receive, consider analyses of the kind that the planning board could prepare. That would give structure and coherence that are sorely needed and very difficult to provide. But I think to sum up, it's a real challenge, and it's one of those that have a delayed payoff, so it's going to take some leadership to insist that attention be given to it.
Okay, we have a number of hands up. It's our intention to run till about 4:45 to let you know where we're headed here. We'll begin with the question here. General Boyd, did you have a question? Or? Yeah.
Yes, Chuck Boyd. In carrying the line of discussion that the last three speakers have been on, the Hart-Rudman Commission, as you may know, one of its 50 major recommendations was the development of a strategy development process, a strategic prioritization mechanism, and a tie to the resource allocation process. We used General Goodpaster, one of the many references in our study, we used the book Waging Peace, and Bob Bowie's book, in which I think you wrote the foreword.
And there's Bob listening to you over there.
My question is this, you point out in there very clearly that the priority that president put on this process, and I think you said that if it was a Thursday, you had an NSC meeting, and the grown-ups came, and the president sat there and presided over it, and religiously with discipline. In the era we now live in, can you envision a process by which every Thursday the president sits down with these Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and his National Security Advisor, and works on strategy? Was that a thing of a past and forgotten time?
I would say that it's well worth considering and weighing, because I can't think of much of anything that a president does that really contributes more to the enduring well-being of the American people than taking the time out to go through that kind of process. Now, it's hard to do because the demands on his time are very many, but the payoff is great and enduring, and it's well worth a president's considering about blocking out a chunk of time. I might also refer to what Eisenhower did every Tuesday morning. He met with the leadership from the Congress, and any time the agenda covered matters of strategy, foreign policy, security, and the like, it was the bipartisan leadership that he met with. And I think a president will be benefited if he can set aside time for consideration of issues of that kind.
I'm going to move along here to other questions. When you do want to intervene, raise your hand, as Professor Rostow is doing.
Let me tell you what I believe, out of my experience thus far, is the critical question. The critical question on population, whether we're speaking of Japan itself, which is very near going over the edge of the cliff, or even in Russia, but certainly in Germany, and in the United States and Latin America, is political. That people have to become convinced, one, that if they let things go on as they are now going, this will result as the end of the human race. I want to repeat that. We're talking about a mortal problem for the human race, not about some trivial problem of shifting of populations from one part of the world to the other. That it also needs to be accompanied, however, by a policy program that shows a way out. because people will not make the very hard choices required in the social life and the cultural life of a society to do something, namely raise the fertility rate, which is goes to the heart of the relationship between men and women and the role of women in various societies, some for centuries being male-dominated. That kind of effort, which will be required, will take a full understanding of the depth of the crisis which we now face. So while I feel benignly toward Andy's evocation of this, devoting more time in the federal government to this task, what ought to be done, it ought to be a task which ends up by not merely defining what needs to be done to reverse the course of events and raise the level of fertility up to 2.1, which is the replacement rate. But what will we need to be done politically, what political leadership has to do to achieve this, and I think to internationalize the issue, to bring into it not merely Japan and Western Europe and the Western Hemisphere, but also China, which is now below 2.1, and they have taken to their own people with the question, not the answer yet. What will we do when we have 350 million people on the safety net when we don't have a safety net now? 350 million people. They have posed this question and they have no answer yet. So this is a universal problem, and it ought to end up with the two questions which I tried to answer. One for the two bosses I had in the 60s, one from John Kennedy, who, when an idea was put to him, would fuss with his tie and so on, say, "What do you want me to do about it today?" Mm-hmm. And for once, LBJ was more cryptic. He would put his chin on his fist and push his eyes towards yours and say, "Therefore." I think we must face up to the therefore problem, including its political component, a part of which is to spread the understanding that we've wasted this period of falling fertility. The gap is now closing. We're about to face the fall in population, and we better damn well take this seriously.
All right, thank you. Now, what I'd like to do to get as many questions as possible is to request the panel just to have one person responding. If one of the other panelists would like to add something, by all means do, but let's see if we can get as many questions as possible. We have a question there.
Charlie Stevenson, National War College. In the national security system, whose job is it or should it be to raise domestic political factors?
Chief of Staff. I don't think it's the National Security Advisor's job. In fact, I had on my watch, and Bud did too, the Iran-Contra affair, and not the Latin America, the Contras. And there was a question of mobilizing public opinion to support the president's policies, and there was some suggestion that should be done by the National Security Council staff. I went to Howard Baker and said, "Howard, that's not my business. That should be yours." And he took it over.
I would just add to the Chief of Staff, maybe occasionally the Vice President.
Okay, next question here. There's a microphone coming to you.
I'm Herb Chandler from the National Defense University. We've talked a great deal, you gentlemen have talked a great deal about coordinating documents and positions that come up from the departments. And my question perhaps is related to Dr. Brzezinski and General Goodpaster's message. To what extent did you all, as national security advisors, send things down to the departments that you thought should be studied, that issues that might have come up but were not current at the present time, things that perhaps the president had mentioned, the president had alluded to, or perhaps things that you thought should be looked at that the departments were not looking at?
Well, I would say, I can only speak for myself, that very frequently there would be tasking not only of the departments, but also of the agency. We haven't talked about the agency at all, and that's a very important element involved here. And the relationship of the agency to the National Security Advisor and the President is an important part of this problem. I would say very frequently the White House would task, either because of the President's stimulation of the National Security Advisor or simply because the National Security Advisor felt the President needed this, very frequently tasking memos would go down.
I was in the agency when he was National Security Advisor. He rained on us all the time.
I would just add to that it was President Eisenhower's practice to receive a briefing at every morning using the material that had been submitted from the CIA, from the State Department, the exchange of messages, and from the Defense Department as well. That was a prime source of seeing that there was something that needed to be looked at, and that was the occasion of calling together these ad hoc meetings. That was my duty, to bring in the responsible people to meet with him in the Oval Office. So, in the term Bob Bowie reminded me of, he could look his principal subordinates in the eye and hear from them their views and digest it with the background of the policy work that had been done previously. But that is a very, very important element in Hamiltonian terms, if I could make the reference, to providing energy in the executive branch of the government.
Hattie.
Thank you. Hattie Babbitt from the Wilson Center. General Goodpaster brought up the issue of executive privilege, and I wonder how the rather more aggressive subpoena activity from the Congress has affected the role of the National Security Advisor and the method of operation that you all think would be most appropriate.
One of the unfortunate consequences is that no one keeps a diary, no one keeps notes, and no one keeps any pieces of paper in the United States government. I think history will be poorly served by a few emails that it can get perhaps some kind of insight into what was happening. Obviously, there are the documents and the memos that are generated for the President, the official record. But the aggressive role of the Congress and the politicizing of foreign policy. I'm not talking about things that are other than foreign policy. I'm talking about foreign policy. If Congress doesn't agree with our policy on Haiti, it turns it into an investigation with subpoena power and uses that then often to summon people and to ask for, to turn this into a quasi, almost inquisition. And I think it's it's destructive to the policy process, I think it's very important for national security advisors and president to defend the prerogative of the presidency, and I suspect that most of us have done that pretty assiduously.
I'll just add one note to that. The documents of the NSC that were considered by the president on which he took action were advisory to the president and were protected in that way at that time. And it seems very difficult to me to find a way to examine these issues in depth and other than in a very myopic way if you could not have that kind of assurance as to the confidentiality between the preparation of this and the president's time of decision, which he would normally make on action in those ad hoc meetings in the Oval Office, on which very careful notes were retained that simply would not be done today.
Congressman Bielenson had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm tempted to argue with Dr. Rostow about population because I think he's got it absolutely wrong. But we'll stick to the question of the day. And let me preface my question by saying that I agree very strongly with Lee Hamilton, that it's been wonderful having you 6 gentlemen here. It's been heartwarming. It's been nice. It's made us think back over the past 50 years of foreign policy and national security issues, and it reminds one how the issues and the times change. My question is less useful than it might have been a few minutes ago because the good ambassador asked a question which led to responses from General Goodpaster and Dr. Brzezinski and Mr. Berger, which answered it at least partially. But let me try it just once again with a couple of specifics which were touched upon, but perhaps could be touched upon just a moment or two longer. In today's world, which is clearly different, no longer bipolar, no longer Cold War, less dangerous, I think it's fair to say in many respects, albeit more diverse and complex problems that our national security people and our foreign policy people have to worry about. Is there not now a growing and, in a sense, new role for the National Security Council, National Security Advisor, especially during Mr. Berger's time, now during Ms. Rice's time, that did not exist to quite that extent, perhaps during the time of you other gentlemen, of a coordinating person and/or body to pull together and work on those issues, not the big eventual big human issues that General Goodpaster was alluding to, which I think are terribly important, or population, or any of these others, but specifically, for example, obviously, terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, where you're talking about formulating policy, but also ensuring that current policy, because the things have to be done now, not just thinking about them, are carried out, whereas you've all suggested, these are not the province simply of defense, of state, of Treasury, of the FBI, of the CIA, but somebody else at least has got to be sure that something's being done, that it's being thought about, that it's being carried out. You did allude to that, Sandy, and so did others, but perhaps you could speak a little more to it.
One of the greatest powers that a president has is the power to determine what is important, to define what is important. And when the president defines an issue as important, it changes the entire character of the decision-making and budget-making process. I would give you an example of AIDS in Africa. That issue didn't arise last year. What happened last year through the work of a number of people, Secretary Albright, Ambassador Holbrooke, and others, is it became essentially perceived as a national security issue. And although this is more than a semantic issue, it became elevated as a presidential issue, and I believe deservedly so. The resources, the attention, the focus brought to bear on the issue increased dramatically. So I do think, as you say, Congressman, that the NSC and derivative of the president has an important, even more important responsibility now in terms of determining what priorities are and what is important for the rest of the government to focus on.
I'll just add one.
Bud McFarland and then General Goodpaster.
Okay, go ahead, Bud.
It's a very good point, and I think this really only happens about every 4 years, where there is tasking. And right now, I'm sure Condi Rice with President Bush is tasking the departments to focus on these very issues, that the memos are going out saying the president is concerned about the threat to American interests of terrorism or of X and Y and Z, and he's tasking the cabinet agencies to study them, to come back and give him options together with costs and risks and trade-offs for how to engage on these several issues. And 6 months from now, those several volumes of national policy will be on the shelf, but hopefully also in the field, trying to advance the national interest.
Okay.
I'll
Yes,
just add
excuse
one
me,
word,
General Goodpaster.
if
yes.
I may, that again, going back to Eisenhower's structure, he had something called the Operations Coordination Board, which operated just about one level down, and their role was coordinating operations, particularly in the execution phase of the policies that had been considered and approved and directed. It was criticized from time to time as being a paper mill, generally by people whose feet it held to the fire to get action on the decisions that had been taken. But that kind of a coordinating operation at that level that pertains to the execution of decisions that had been taken, that also is one of the services to the president, who ultimately bears that responsibility himself.
Okay, the question here, then we'll have another question.
I have my name is Ivan Grdisic. I am Croatian ambassador to the United States. I have a question that relates to the session before. We heard that sometimes the loyalty to the president, to the boss, is stronger than the loyalty to the issue. How does this reflect to the hiring, to the choosing of the advisor to the president? Because that may be an important link. Thank you. And let me thank the center and the panel for excellent insight into what's called the role of advisor in modern American politics. There's a bunch of books on that, and it's a pleasure to see you all here. Thank you.
I don't think there needs to be a conflict. I don't believe there's a conflict between your commitment to your own views and your principle and the commitment to the president. I think the distinction is one that many of my colleagues have made between before the decision and after the decision. I think before the decision, you owe the president your best judgment of what the right course is, and to design a process that brings other people's judgments to bear. Once he's made a decision, you execute it or you quit.
That's right. Yeah, there may come a point where you want to resign. I know when I was hired by Ronald Reagan, I laid out areas where I thought I had differences with his existing policy, so he would know what to expect of me. But you have to act in accordance with your conscience.
Okay, question here.
I'm Dr. Willie Curtis from the U.S. Naval Academy. As you are aware, the structure in which you operated your tenure was established in 1947 by the National Security Act of 1947. In 2007, that act will have been, in this structure, will have been enforced about 60 years. Is it not time to reassess the National Security Act and see if the framework that it established is applicable to these first decades of the 21st century in which we have various threats?
Well, a number of people and institutions have studied the national security making process and have made recommendations for changes. And some changes have taken place anyway by osmosis. The style of the staffs have changed, some component elements have been changed, abolished, for example, like the planning board. But by and large, these have been incremental changes, which perhaps have improved the system, occasionally perhaps worsened it. Mm-hmm. But so far, no one has come up with a convincing case for a radically different structure, even though some proposals have been made. So there is a continuing discussion on this subject, but as of now, no compelling case that has won the attraction, the support, either of the president or of the Congress.
The genius of the legislation is that it creates a structure that's totally flexible. The president can do with it what he wants.
That's right.
So why change it?
Ambassador Gildenhorn.
Dr. Brzezinski mentioned the PIFIAB board, the Foreign Intelligence Board. And I'm curious as to the role that plays. Is it a resource drawn on by the National Security Advisor, by the president, and how serious is the board?
Well, it depends a little bit on how it is staffed and used. It has tended to become somewhat of a repository for people who can't afford to buy ambassadorships but are otherwise generous. And that's not the best use of the board. That's one of the reasons why it should be infused with some meaningful purpose. I think it could be helpful. There were times, for example, when there were serious opportunities for technological innovation in intelligence acquisition, when some members of the board made a very important contribution because they were specialists, they were interested, and the board was an instrument for significant innovation in the technologies, the techniques of gathering information, of operating intelligence, particularly in a politically closed environment such as existed in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I think the board could be used, for example, for anticipation of longer-range trends, if properly staffed.
Can I just, because I think we used the board, I think, much more actively than perhaps Zbig did under Senator Rudman and his
Well,
predecessors.
we didn't use it at all because President Carter was determined to reduce the number of committees and boards, so he simply abolished it.
But I think it played a very important role for us, looking at very sensitive issues. Sometimes because it reports to the president, has a certain expertise in intelligence matters and security matters, and on a wide variety of occasions, they would be tasked with doing very sensitive analyses of subjects and reporting back to the president. And because they were not necessarily subject to congressional review, it was a very valuable instrument during the Clinton administration.
Okay, a question in the back. Yes.
Yes, Ann Peterson, a visitor from Chicago. And I'd like to ask the panel whether, in their view, the personal demographic characteristics of the person holding the role has an impact of any kind on the proper functioning of the role of the National Security Advisor.
Yes.
What does she mean by personal demographic?
And you want to explain that a little bit? You've stumped the panel here, and
Should they all be people with Italian names? Or
When I think of demographic characteristics, I think I'm from Chicago. I come from Chicago, so there are ethnic and racial diversities and gender and age and all of those kinds of personal characteristics that sometimes come to bear on how one functions in a role.
I think they ought to be picked on the basis of talent, pure and simple.
it's pretty obvious that the national security advisors tend to be white men, isn't it?
No.
Not necessarily.
No, we had Colin
Not
Powell.
now, however.
Colin Powell was
Colin Powell was,
National Security
Colin
Advisor.
Powell succeeded me.
No, I was referring to the panel here. Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's another question back here. Did you have a question, sir, at the camera? Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. A question here, yeah.
I've heard the panel.
Let's use the microphone if you would, please. And
Hi. I've heard the panel say this afternoon that it shouldn't be responsible to Congress, that oversight is not a good idea, and it's a drawback on the security advisor, and also that there shouldn't be reversion of the National Security Act of 1947. Isn't it a fact, though, that the National Security Act of 1947 only establishes a council? The staff, the security advisor, and all the rest of this does not exist in the law. So what are we talking about here?
any response?
But we're talking about what we have been talking about.
Well, the president can pick whatever staff he wants. Yes, the law creates the council, and that's why it's totally flexible. The president can create the staff.
I think it's inevitable that there's going to be a small foreign policy staff in the White House, whether it's statutorily directed or not, if for no other reason, to prepare the president for the daily tasks that he has to face.
Okay, another question here.
Alexander Petrov, Russian Academy of Sciences, presently canon scholar. We're just kind of wondering, anything you should regret you done differently in the past? So, I mean, you might do differently while you be, advise the presidents.
What's the question?
Is there anything that you would regret looking back? And
The answer is
the
yes.
advice that you've given to the president.
Okay.
Very sorry.
General Goodpaster.
Well,
Maybe we can get 6 sorries.
Looking back, I think there were sins of omission. Speak for myself. there were times when I wish I'd been more alert to the possible implications of conceivable events that did indeed occur. For example, sitting there the last day that the U-2 flight could be flown, being May 1st, a day of particular significance in Russia, if we had not wanted to run too close to the summit that was planned for mid-May of 1960, but somebody might have thought that May Day was really not the day to fly over Russia.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, go ahead.
John Lee from Sierra Leone. My question is, what is life after service as National Security Advisor, and what do you think National Security Advisors after service should focus their attention?
Well, it's a quick transition. I went to Andrews Air Force Base to see the retiring president off. I had my motorcade with me. I had my Secret Service guys with me. The president left. Then I kind of looked around, and there were no cars. Finally, the Secret Service guy came up and said, "Can I give you a lift?" Which I gladly accepted. I think after service of this kind, but it's important during that service always to remember that this is a very brief transitional phase in your life. And I kept saying that to myself almost every week. Don't let you feel that this is real. After that, I think most you can do is try to apply the experience you have gained in some meaningful fashion to the continuing, very pluralistic dialogue in this country about national strategy and the role of the United States in the world. I think that's what we can all do, and I think in different ways we are, in effect, all doing.
I think we'll have the final question back here.
Naftali Ben David with the Chicago Tribune. And I wanted to ask about this standoff with China that recently ended and what it might say about the workings and decision-making and structure of the foreign policy of the current administration and how that might differ from some of the administrations in which you all served.
Well, I think they've handled it well. One can argue, as some people in the press have, that they should have been tougher right at the outset, but as Condi Rice said on Wolf Blitzer's program on Sunday, at that point in time they didn't know where the American service people were, under what conditions they were being held, so they felt it necessary to be very firm. They have achieved what they set out to achieve. The service people have been released. We have not apologized, nor should we. And I think it's been, we ought to move on now and try to restore our full relationship with the People's Republic of China.
I agree with that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think one of the more memorable sentences we've had this afternoon from the panel came from Professor Rostow, who said the good Lord produces only a small number of first-rate people. You would all agree that these six fit into that group of first-rate people. We owe them our thanks not just for this afternoon's session, but for their service to the country, to their presidents over a period of time. They really are remarkable people. We're delighted to have had them here. Ed Dirigian, it's been a great pleasure to work with you and the James Baker Institute. The Wilson Center has been pleased to join with the Baker Institute to put on this program this afternoon. The text of the comments of these national security advisors will be widely distributed, as will the tape that have been made here. So we've had a marvelous afternoon. Our thanks, our deep thanks to the panel for a tremendously informative and stimulating session. Thank you all for attending.
Well,